The incident at Tel Afar, which he witnessed and documented, where the mother and father actually, I think this is one of the photos, right? Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, he was on patrol with a unit, and they had a checkpoint roadblock, and a car was speeding towards it. Didn't stop. They did shoot up in the air. And it was a night where, at that point, Tal Afar was dangerous, empty. Curfews were being observed. Streets were empty. There was barely any lights. And this car didn't stop. Soldiers shot at the car, and the parents were in the front seat, were killed instantly. And in the back seat, there were 5 children. And the soldiers, once they realized what happened, they started taking the children out of the car. And this photo was shortly thereafter, and obviously the children were beyond traumatized. One of the children actually ended up having a very grievous wound, wasn't able to walk. That's a longer story. He eventually got treatment in the United States, and that was partly because of these photos really had a huge impact. And this girl really is, in this moment, is just complete shock. She's about 6 years old here, I believe, 5. And the soldiers are standing around her. And what's interesting is that many years later, Chris actually found one of the soldiers from that night, and he has really bad PTSD now, and kind of started hanging out with them and was doing a long-term story on PTSD, which is very difficult to do. But that was sort of something that, there were a lot of different stories that came out of that photo. But her brother, who was very injured, some readers saw the photos, were moved, and Ted Kennedy's office was contacted, and Kennedy, who had been against the war from the beginning, decided to help, and he reached out to a philanthropist that donated money for the boy to come to the US for treatment, was able to walk again. Chris visited him in Boston, in the hospital, and then the boy returned home, and I believe 2 years later was killed in more violence. So the story has not a lot of happy endings. And there was a big New York Times story several years ago where they found this girl again and showed her this image, much to her, I don't know, she was distressed. But, you know, Chris called me the night that this happened. He was able to file his pictures, and he did, and was kicked out of the embed a few days later. He knew that would happen. But he was, you know, it was definitely one of the more, one of many distressing things he saw during his time in the war. But even then, he was balanced. You know, there was a moment of being upset with the military, and then the next moment saying, these are just boys, and this is what they're trained to do. And he really was, he always was, sort of what, to the point we were talking about earlier about him engaging in sort of politics or blame, he really never did that. He didn't have an agenda in that sense, you know. He was really a journalist through and through in that sense, but, you know, obviously, as a humanitarian with compassion, of course, an incident such as this is, you know, devastating.
There's something that I remember, you know, he had said about this situation was that, you know, war is hell. When people say war is hell, this is what they're talking about, and that was what he was trying to convey, and that, you know, because he knew so much about Iraq and had been there for so long, you know, he said that this is something that happened all the time. He just happened to be there when it happened, and you know, I don't think it was lost on him that this not only shed some light on this family, but that shed some light on how the American troops were handling these situations, and that, you know, there might have been some change because of this incident. I mean, it's horrific, but, you know, you like to think that you know, some tactics have changed because of that.
Well, they did, because then these pictures were splashed across a lot of newspapers, and Paul Wolfowitz actually invited Chris to come to the Pentagon and talk to him about what happened, and they did revise some of the rules about engagement at checkpoints after that incident. So it's a very unusual example of where change, albeit incremental, this type of thing did happen again. Again, it's just that Chris happened to be there to document it. But it did spark a little bit of conversation on the higher echelons, and it's again, it's the exception and not the rule when that happens. But it's, again, power of the photographs and Chris's ability in that moment to be a professional and document what he saw.